I'm standing in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Kemper Building in downtown Chicago, and I can feel my hands shaking so badly that I have to press them flat against the cold mahogany table to make them stop. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, Lake Michigan stretches out like a sheet of hammered steel under the gray November sky, but I can't focus on the view. I can only focus on the woman sitting directly across from me, the woman I haven't seen in 13 years, the woman who is currently smiling at me like she's already won. Rebecca, my daughter, 43 years old now, though I wouldn't have recognized her if I'd passed her on the street. She's wearing a navy Armani suit that I know cost at least $3,000 because I used to work in school administration and had to approve budgets. I know what things cost. Her dark hair is styled in that expensive way that looks effortless but isn't, and her nails are painted a deep burgundy, perfectly manicured, tapping rhythmically against the leather portfolio in front of her. She looks successful. She looks powerful. She looks nothing like the exhausted, resentful young mother who walked out of her son's life when he was 5 years old and never looked back. That son, my grandson Ethan, is sitting beside me right now. 18 years old, 6 feet tall, with sandy blonde hair that falls across his forehead and those remarkable green eyes that have always seemed to see more than other people see. He's wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis, looking impossibly calm for someone whose entire future is currently being negotiated by lawyers who charge $800 an hour. His hands are folded on the table in front of him, and he's watching his mother with an expression I can't quite read. There's no anger there, no fear, just this quiet, steady observation that makes me more nervous than if he were crying or shouting. On Rebecca's left sits her attorney, a man named Kessler who looks exactly like what he is, a corporate shark dressed in a charcoal suit with a Rolex that catches the light every time he moves his wrist. He's maybe 55, with silver hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from winning too many cases against people who can't afford to fight back. He's been talking for the past 10 minutes, and every word out of his mouth makes my stomach twist tighter. On my right is our attorney, Gerald Winters, who I've known for almost 20 years. He handled my retirement paperwork when I left my job as assistant superintendent of Lincoln Park Schools, and he helped me establish legal guardianship of Ethan all those years ago. He's a good man, kind and thorough, but he's not a shark. He's a general practice attorney who usually handles wills and real estate closings, and right now, looking at him as he shuffles through papers with hands that are starting to show his age, I can see the worry in his eyes. This morning, before we came to this meeting, he took me aside in the courthouse parking garage and said words I'll never forget. "Margaret, I have to be honest with you. We might lose this." Those words are still echoing in my head as Kessler slides a stack of documents across the table toward Gerald. The sound of paper on wood seems impossibly loud in this climate-controlled room with its abstract art on the walls and its leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "As you can see," Kessler says, his voice smooth and practiced, "my client has substantial legal standing here. Ms. Harrison is Ethan's biological mother. Her name is on his birth certificate, and she has never legally relinquished her parental rights. The guardianship established by Mrs. Chen was temporary in nature and was never intended to supersede maternal rights, particularly in matters of this financial magnitude. Financial magnitude. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not about Ethan. Not about the 13 years I spent raising him alone, learning about autism and sensory processing and communication devices, spending my retirement savings on therapies that insurance wouldn't cover, sitting up nights when he couldn't sleep, teaching him to read and write and code and become the extraordinary young man sitting next to me. No, this is about money. Specifically, this is about $7.8 million. 7 months ago, when Ethan was still 17, the technology company Nexus Communications paid him that amount for an app he created called BridgeSpeak. It's a revolutionary communication tool that uses AI and visual symbols to help autistic children and adults express complex emotions and needs that their words can't capture. Ethan built it because he needed it himself. Because when he was younger, before he developed better verbal skills, he would get so frustrated trying to explain what he was feeling or what was overwhelming him. So he created something beautiful and functional and deeply needed, and Silicon Valley noticed. The sale closed 2 weeks after his 18th birthday. The money is currently sitting in a trust fund that Gerald and I established with a financial advisor, being carefully managed for Ethan's future, his education, his continued development of BridgeSpeak, his independence. We've been so careful with it. We've done everything right. And 2 weeks after that money hit the account, my daughter called me for the first time in 13 years, not to congratulate her son, not to apologize for abandoning him. She called to inform me that her attorney would be contacting us regarding her parental rights and her claim to oversight of Ethan's assets. Mrs. Chen established guardianship under circumstances that were, at best, incomplete disclosure, Kessler continues, and I watch him as he talks. This man who doesn't know us, who doesn't know what we've been through, who is being paid enormous amounts of money to rewrite history. My client experienced severe postpartum depression following Ethan's birth, a documented medical condition that affected her judgment and her ability to parent. She did not abandon her son. She made the painful decision to temporarily place him with family while she sought treatment and attempted to establish financial stability. I want to scream. I want to slam my hands on this expensive table and tell him he's a liar, that Rebecca never sought treatment, that she moved to California for a sales job and simply stopped calling, stopped sending the sporadic checks she'd been sending, stopped existing in her son's life as if he'd never been born. But Gerald touches my arm gently, and I force myself to stay quiet, to let him do his job. My client made efforts to maintain contact, Kessler says, and now he's pulling out more documents, and my heart is sinking because I don't know what those papers say, what lies they might contain. She sent financial support. She sent letters and gifts. She made phone calls. Unfortunately, those attempts were not successful, and over time, the relationship deteriorated. But that does not negate her legal status as Ethan's mother, nor does it eliminate her responsibility and her right to ensure her son's financial interests are properly protected. Her son's financial interests, I say, and my voice comes out harder than I intended. Ethan is 18 years old. He's a legal adult. He created that app with his own brilliant mind, his own work, his own understanding of what autistic people need because he is autistic and no one was helping him the way he needed to be helped. Kessler gives me a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Chen, Ethan has a documented disability. He has been classified as special needs since age 3. There are legitimate questions about his capacity to manage such substantial assets without proper guidance, and my client, as his mother, has both the legal standing and the moral obligation to ensure I can speak for myself. Ethan's voice cuts through the room, quiet but absolutely clear. Everyone turns to look at him. He's still sitting in that same calm position, hands folded, but now he's looking directly at Kessler, and there's something in his expression that makes the attorney pause mid-sentence. I'm autistic, Ethan says, his tone matter-of-fact. I'm not intellectually disabled. I graduated high school with a 4.0 GPA. I took college-level computer science courses at Northwestern. I created an app that a major tech company valued at $7.8 million. I can manage my own assets. Ethan, sweetheart, Rebecca says, and her voice is so sweet, so motherly, so absolutely fake that it makes my skin crawl. This is the first time she's spoken directly to him since we sat down. No one is questioning your intelligence. You're brilliant. I've always known that. I'm so proud of you. She has no right to say that. She has no right to claim pride in accomplishments she did nothing to support, in a person she never bothered to know. I watch Ethan's face looking for anger or hurt, but he just looks at her with that same steady, unreadable expression. But honey, Rebecca continues, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping into that confidential tone that I'm sure she uses in sales meetings. $7 million is a life-changing amount of money. People will try to take advantage of you. You need protection. You need family who understands business and finance. Your grandmother loves you, I know that. But she pauses delicately. She's 75 years old. She was a school administrator. She doesn't have experience managing this kind of wealth. The implication is clear. I'm too old, too unsophisticated, too limited in my understanding of high finance. Never mind that I managed multi-million-dollar school budgets for 3 decades. Never mind that I've successfully raised her son while she was off living her child-free life. I'm simply not qualified to protect his interests the way she apparently is. What we're proposing, Kessler says, pulling the conversation back to his territory, is a structured arrangement that protects everyone's interests. Ms. Harrison is not seeking to remove Ethan from your care, Mrs. Chen. She's simply requesting her legal right to parental involvement in major financial decisions, with appropriate oversight to ensure the assets are managed for Ethan's long-term benefit. We believe a family court would look favorably on this arrangement, given the circumstances. Gerald clears his throat. Mr. Kessler, Ethan is 18. He's no longer a minor. Ms. Harrison's parental rights are not superseded by reaching the age of majority in cases involving documented disabilities. Kessler interrupts smoothly. There are numerous precedents for continued parental involvement in financial guardianship for special needs adults, particularly when substantial assets are involved. I can provide you with case law. I feel sick. Gerald had tried to explain this to me yesterday, sitting in his small office with its diplomas on the wall and its view of a parking lot. He'd said that because Ethan has an autism diagnosis, because he had an IEP all through school, because there's documentation of his disability. Rebecca's attorneys could potentially argue for ongoing parental authority over financial matters. They could claim he needs protection. They could convince a judge that family court jurisdiction doesn't end at 18 for disabled adults. They could win. How much? I ask suddenly. How much money are you actually claiming she has a right to? Kessler and Rebecca exchange a look. We believe a fair arrangement would acknowledge Ms. Harrison's years of missed parenting and the financial burden of reestablishing her relationship with her son, Kessler says carefully. We're proposing that Ms. Harrison receive financial guardianship over 50% of the assets with $3.9 million, I say flatly. You want $3.9 million of money that Ethan earned. We prefer to think of it as ensuring proper family involvement in. You want half of my grandson's money because you gave birth to him and then walked away for 13 years. The room goes very quiet. Rebecca's smile has frozen on her face. Kessler looks like he's trying to decide whether to be offended or amused. Gerald is staring down at his papers, probably wishing he was anywhere else. And Ethan reaches over and takes my hand. His grip is warm and steady, and when I look at him, startled, he's looking right at me with those green eyes that have always seemed older than his years. Let her talk, Grandma, he says quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. Trust me. There's something in his voice. Not fear, not resignation, but something else. Something that sounds almost like confidence, like certainty, like he knows something I don't know. Rebecca launches into her prepared speech, talking about motherhood and rights and second chances and proper financial management. Kessler is nodding along, occasionally interjecting legal terms and precedents. Gerald is trying to respond, but I can hear the uncertainty in his voice, the knowledge that we're fighting an uphill battle with limited weapons. But I'm not listening to any of them anymore. I'm looking at Ethan, at the way he's sitting there so calm, so still, so absolutely unfazed by the fact that these people are trying to take his future away. And I'm remembering what he said. Trust me. I don't understand what he means. I don't know what he could possibly have planned, what defense he could possibly mount against biological maternal rights and expensive lawyers and family court precedents. But I've spent 13 years learning to trust this extraordinary boy, this young man who sees patterns where others see chaos, who thinks in ways that I'll never fully understand, who has always been 3 steps ahead of where I thought we were. So I squeeze his hand back twice, our old signal, the one that means, I'm here, I understand. And I force myself to sit back in my chair and let them talk. And I try desperately to ignore the voice in my head that keeps repeating what Gerald said this morning. We might lose this. I need to go back. I need to explain how we got here, to this conference room with its view of Lake Michigan and its lawyers who charge more per hour than most people make in a week. I need to explain who Ethan is and who I am, and most importantly, who Rebecca was before she became this polished stranger demanding money from the son she abandoned. 18 years ago, Rebecca was 25 years old and pregnant with a baby she hadn't planned for. She'd been married for exactly 11 months to a man named Daniel Pearson, someone she'd met at a pharmaceutical sales conference, and married 6 weeks later in what I knew at the time was a mistake, but kept my mouth shut about because that's what mothers do. Daniel was charming in that smooth, empty way that some men are. all promises and no substance. When Rebecca told him she was pregnant, he stayed for another 3 months, just long enough to make it clear he wanted no part of fatherhood, and then he filed for divorce and moved to Arizona. I never heard from him again, and neither did she. Ethan was born on a cold March morning at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I was there in the delivery room, holding Rebecca's hand, and I remember the moment they placed him in her arms, this tiny, perfect baby with a shock of dark hair and the most serious expression I'd ever seen on a newborn. I waited for Rebecca's face to transform the way new mothers' faces are supposed to transform, with that overwhelming love that people talk about. But what I saw instead was distance, disconnect. She held him like he was something fragile that might break if she squeezed too hard. And when he started crying, she handed him to the nurse with an expression close to relief. I told myself it was exhaustion, trauma from the delivery, hormones, all the things people say to excuse the feeling that something isn't quite right. Rebecca brought Ethan home to her apartment in Lincoln Park, and I visited every day, helping with feedings and diaper changes and the 1,000 small tasks that come with a newborn. She went back to her sales job when he was 8 weeks old, leaving him with a daycare that cost more than her rent. On weekends, she'd bring him to my house in Evanston, saying she needed a break, needed to catch up on sleep, needed time to herself. Those weekend visits stretched longer. One night became 2, then 3. By the time Ethan was 6 months old, he was spending more time at my house than at hers. I was 62 years old then, still working as assistant superintendent for Lincoln Park schools, and I'd rearrange my schedule to accommodate him. I'd take him to my office sometimes, setting up a portable crib in the corner while I worked through budget reports and curriculum proposals. My colleagues thought it was temporary, that Rebecca just needed time to adjust to single motherhood. I wanted to believe that too. But then came Ethan's diagnosis. He was almost 3 years old, and I'd been noticing things for months. The way he wouldn't make eye contact, how he'd line up his toy cars in perfect rows instead of playing with them, the way certain sounds would make him cover his ears and rock back and forth. Rebecca dismissed my concerns. She said all children develop differently, that boys were slower with language, that I was overreacting. But I'd worked in schools for 30 years. I knew what I was seeing. I took him to a developmental pediatrician without telling Rebecca. Dr. Sarah Kim spent 2 hours with Ethan, running assessments and observations, and at the end of it, she sat me down in her office and said, "Your grandson has moderate autism spectrum disorder. He's going to need early intervention, speech therapy, occupational therapy, possibly ABA. The earlier we start, the better his outcomes will be." I remember sitting there in that small office with its posters about developmental milestones, holding Ethan on my lap while he arranged and rearranged a set of colored blocks, and feeling this overwhelming wave of love mixed with fear. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Fear of what this diagnosis would mean in a world that doesn't always have patience for children who think differently. When I told Rebecca, she cried. But they weren't tears of sadness for Ethan. They were tears of overwhelm for herself. "I can't do this," she said. "Mom, I can't. I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is. I can't handle therapies and appointments and all this specialized care. I don't know how." "I'll help you," I told her. "We'll figure it out together." But helping turned into doing. Rebecca's sales job required more travel, or maybe she just volunteered for trips that took her away from Chicago for longer stretches. Ethan started speech therapy twice a week, occupational therapy once a week. I took him to every appointment. I learned about sensory processing disorder, about visual schedules and social stories, about the way his brilliant mind worked in patterns and systems that made perfect sense once you understood the logic behind them. By the time he was 4, he was living with me full-time. Rebecca would visit every few weeks, staying for an hour or two, bringing toys he didn't play with because she didn't understand what he actually liked. She'd try to hug him, and he'd pull away, not because he didn't care, but because unexpected touch was overwhelming for him, and I could see the rejection register on her face every time. When Ethan was 5 years old, Rebecca came to my house on a Saturday afternoon and told me she'd been offered a promotion. Regional sales manager for the Western Territory, based in Los Angeles. 60% pay increase, company car, full benefits. It was an opportunity she couldn't pass up, she said. She'd be traveling constantly anyway, she said. It made sense for Ethan to stay with me, just temporarily, just until she got established in the new role. Temporarily was the word she used. We both knew it was a lie. She moved to California in August. She sent checks for the first 8 months. $500 here, $300 there, never consistent, never enough to actually cover the cost of raising a child with intensive therapy needs. She called on Ethan's birthday that first year. She sent a card at Christmas, and then slowly, the contact faded to nothing. The checks stopped. The phone calls stopped. Her social media showed her at company events and weekend trips to wine country and beach vacations with friends. She'd deleted every photo of Ethan from her profiles. It was like he'd never existed. I established legal guardianship when he was 6. Gerald handled the paperwork, and it was surprisingly simple because Rebecca didn't contest it. She signed the documents I mailed to her and sent them back without a single word of explanation or apology. I retired from my job at 67, took my pension and my retirement savings, and devoted myself completely to Ethan. Those years were hard, but they were also the most purposeful of my life. I learned to communicate in the ways that worked for him. When he couldn't find words, we developed our system of hand squeezes and humming. 2 squeezes meant, I'm overwhelmed, I need a break. 3 meant, I'm okay, just thinking. I learned which textures bothered him, which sounds were painful, which routines made him feel safe. I advocated for him at school, fighting for the accommodations he needed, celebrating every milestone that came harder for him than for other children. And I watched him grow into someone extraordinary. By age 7, he was reading at a high school level. By 9, he'd taught himself basic coding by watching YouTube videos. By 12, he was creating simple programs and apps, his mind working in algorithms and logical sequences that made perfect sense to him. His verbal skills improved steadily with therapy, though he'd always be someone who needed time to process, who sometimes struggled to explain complex emotions, who found social interaction exhausting. When he was 15, he came to me with an idea. He wanted to create an app that would help other autistic kids communicate the way he'd struggled to communicate when he was younger. Something that used pictures and symbols and AI to translate complex internal experiences into language that neurotypical people could understand. He showed me rough sketches, flowcharts, wireframes. His hands were shaking with excitement as he explained how it would work. I didn't understand half of what he was saying, but I understood his passion. I understood that this was important. I used part of my retirement savings to buy him a better computer, to pay for an online course in advanced programming, to get him access to the tools he needed. He worked on that app for 2 years, through high school, through the social challenges and sensory overloads and exhaustion that came with being an autistic teenager in a neurotypical world. At 17, he entered a local tech competition for young developers. He didn't win first place, he came in 3rd, but someone from the audience approached us afterward. A venture capitalist named Michael Torres who specialized in assistive technology startups. He asked Ethan to send him the full demo. 6 weeks later, he called to say that Nexus Communications wanted to meet. The negotiations took 4 months. Gerald brought in a tech attorney to review the contracts. They offered Ethan $7.8 million for BridgeSpeak, with retained creative control and ongoing royalties. The day before his 18th birthday, we signed the papers. 2 weeks later, the money transferred. Our modest life in my 3-bedroom house in Evanston didn't change much. Ethan still did his homework at the kitchen table, still had his Thursday therapy appointments, still organized his books by color and size. But we had security. We had his future funded. We had everything we'd worked so hard for. And then Rebecca called. Not to say congratulations, not to say she was proud, not to apologize for 13 years of silence. She called to tell me she'd hired an attorney. She called to tell me that as Ethan's mother, she had rights. She called to tell me that she was coming back to Chicago, and we needed to discuss the situation, as if her son's success was a problem to be managed rather than a miracle to be celebrated. As if the money mattered more than the brilliant, gentle, extraordinary young man sitting beside me in this conference room right now. That's how we got here. That's the story that brought us to this table with these sharks who smell blood in the water. And sitting here now, listening to Rebecca talk about parental rights and maternal obligations, All I can think is that she gave up the right to call herself his mother the day she stopped fighting for him. But unfortunately, I'm not the one who gets to decide what rights she has. That's up to judges and lawyers and family court precedents, and according to Gerald, we might lose. The meeting in the conference room ended with Kessler handing Gerald a formal notice of intent to file motions in Illinois Family Court. Rebecca smiled at Ethan as she left, touching his shoulder. He stiffened immediately at the unexpected contact and said, "I'll see you soon, sweetheart. We have so much catching up to do." The way she said it made my blood run cold, like she'd already won, like it was only a matter of time before she got what she came for. In the elevator going down, Gerald was quiet. Ethan was calm, scrolling through something on his phone. I felt like I was going to be sick. When we reached the parking garage, Gerald finally spoke. "They're going to file within 48 hours, he said, his voice heavy. "Margaret, I need you to understand what we're facing. Rebecca has biological parent status. She has the birth certificate, and with Ethan's autism diagnosis on record, they're going to argue that he needs parental oversight for major financial decisions, regardless of his age." "But he's 18, I said. "He's legally an adult. He's brilliant. He created that app himself." "I know that. You know that. But family court has broad discretion when it comes to disabled adults and financial protection. They've filed these cases before. I spent last night researching precedents. There's a case from 2019 where parents successfully gained financial conservatorship over their 23-year-old autistic daughter after she inherited money from her grandfather. Another one from 2021 involving a 19-year-old with Asperger's who won a settlement. In both cases, the courts ruled that parental involvement was necessary to protect the individual's interests. I stared at him. Those people wanted their parents involved. Rebecca abandoned Ethan, which we'll argue. But Margaret, we don't have documentation of that abandonment. No returned letters that we kept, no records of child support she failed to pay because the payments were always voluntary and sporadic, no evidence of us trying to contact her and being refused. It becomes her word against ours, and she's going to testify about postpartum depression, about making difficult choices, about always loving her son even from a distance. That's a lie. It's a narrative that plays well in court. Gerald rubbed his face tiredly. And they're smart. They're not asking for full conservatorship. They're asking for joint financial oversight, which sounds reasonable to a judge. A mother wanting to be involved in her disabled son's financial decisions after he suddenly comes into millions of dollars. They'll frame you as well-meaning but unsophisticated, possibly even as someone who might be taken advantage of by bad actors trying to get to Ethan's money through you. That's ridiculous. I've protected him his entire life. I believe you, but we need evidence. We need documentation. We need something concrete that proves she abandoned him and has no right to claim parental involvement now. He looked at me with genuine sympathy. Start going through everything you have. Old bank statements, emails, anything that shows the pattern of her absence. We have maybe 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by years of files and documents, trying to find proof of something I'd never thought I'd need to prove. I had Ethan's therapy records, his school files, his medical history. I had my own bank statements showing the money I'd spent on his care. But I didn't have anything that definitively proved Rebecca had abandoned him. I'd never kept the few checks she'd sent because I'd deposited them immediately, desperate for any financial help. I'd never printed her emails or text messages because I'd deleted them in anger and hurt. I'd never documented her absence because I'd been too busy actually raising her son to think about building a legal case against her. Ethan found me there at 11 o'clock at night, still searching through boxes. He sat down across from me, not saying anything at first, just watching me with those observant green eyes. "You're not going to find what you're looking for," he said finally. "I have to try. Gerald said we need evidence. Grandma." His voice was patient. She was careful. She never promised anything in writing. She never established a formal child support agreement. She never signed anything that could be used against her now. She protected herself legally, even while she was abandoning me emotionally. The accuracy of his assessment shouldn't have surprised me. Ethan had always been perceptive about patterns and systems, but it still hurt to hear it stated so plainly. "Then what do we do?" I asked, and I heard the desperation in my own voice. "We wait," he said. "And we watch. She's going to make mistakes, Grandma. People like her always do." I didn't understand what he meant, but I was too exhausted to press him. We went to bed, and I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that conference room, about Rebecca's confident smile, about Kessler's expensive suit, and his casual certainty that they would win. The formal motions were filed 2 days later, just as Gerald predicted. Rebecca was requesting joint financial guardianship over Ethan's assets, citing her parental rights and her concern for his long-term welfare given his documented disability. The filing included a statement from Rebecca detailing her struggles with postpartum depression, her difficult decision to temporarily place Ethan with family while she sought stability, and her deep regret at the years of lost connection. She claimed she'd sent letters and gifts that were never acknowledged. She claimed she'd tried to call, but I'd refused to put Ethan on the phone. She claimed she'd sent more money than she actually had, inflating the amounts and the frequency. They were lies, all of it, but they were lies told convincingly, with enough partial truth woven in to make them plausible. Yes, she'd had a difficult time after Ethan was born. Yes, she'd left him with me. Yes, there had been some money sent. The lies were in the framing, in the claims of ongoing effort, in the painting of herself as a struggling mother who'd done her best rather than what she actually was, a woman who'd walked away because her son was inconvenient. Gerald filed our response, arguing that Rebecca had voluntarily relinquished her parenting role, that I had established legal guardianship which she'd never contested, and that Ethan was a competent adult fully capable of managing his own affairs. But reading our filing next to theirs, I could see how thin our case looked. We had legal arguments. They had emotion and medical terminology and parental rights. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Rebecca's legal team began a campaign that was clearly designed to establish her credibility and undermine ours. She gave an interview to TechCrunch, one of the major technology news websites, about being reunited with her successful son. The article included old baby photos of Ethan. Where had she even kept those? And quotes from Rebecca about how proud she was of his accomplishments, how she'd always known he was special, how difficult it had been to be separated from him by circumstances beyond her control. The article went viral in tech circles. Suddenly, Ethan's story was everywhere. The autistic teenager who'd created a revolutionary communication app and sold it for millions. Except in every version of the story that spread online, Rebecca was there in the narrative. Sometimes as the devoted single mother who'd supported his dreams. Sometimes as the parent who'd made difficult sacrifices. Never as the woman who'd abandoned him. I watched those articles spread with a sick feeling in my stomach. She was controlling the narrative. She was rewriting history in real time, and thousands of people were believing her version because they had no reason not to. The comment sections were full of people praising her for being a supportive mother, for prioritizing her son's welfare, for stepping up now to protect his interests. Some people even criticized me, suggesting that grandmothers who took over parenting sometimes alienated the biological parents, that I might be trying to control Ethan's money for my own benefit. The attacks on my character shouldn't have hurt. They were from strangers who knew nothing about our lives. But they did. I'd given up my career for Ethan. I'd spent my retirement savings on his therapies. I'd sat with him through meltdowns and celebrations, through the hard days and the beautiful ones. And now I was being painted as a manipulative old woman who'd stolen a child and was now trying to steal his fortune. Gerald suggested we do our own interview, tell our side of the story. But Ethan refused. "It'll make it worse," he said calmly. "She wants us to fight publicly. She wants emotion and accusations because that makes us look bitter and vindictive. We need to let her keep talking." "But people believe her," I said. "Some people believe her," he corrected. "The people who matter will see the truth eventually. Just wait." His confidence baffled me. But I trusted him, so I stayed quiet while Rebecca did more interviews, each one carefully crafted to make her look sympathetic. She talked about the challenges of being a single mother. She talked about her regret at missing years of Ethan's life. She talked about wanting to make amends and be part of his future now that she was in a better place financially and emotionally. She never mentioned the 13 years of silence. She never mentioned the birthday calls that never came, The Christmases without even a card, the therapy appointments and school meetings, and hard nights that she was never there for. She rewrote all of it into a story where she was a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own choices. Then came the motion for supervised visitation. Kessler filed paperwork requesting that Rebecca be granted court-ordered time with Ethan pending the resolution of the financial guardianship case. The reasoning was that they needed to rebuild their relationship, and that supervised visits would demonstrate Rebecca's genuine interest in her son beyond financial matters. Gerald tried to fight it, but the judge, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Henley, who I'd hoped would see through Rebecca's act, granted the motion. 2 visits per week, 1 hour each, supervised by a court-appointed family therapist. The first visit was scheduled for the following Monday. I was terrified of what those visits might mean. What would Rebecca say to Ethan when I wasn't there? Would she manipulate him with promises or guilt? Would she convince him that having her in his life was somehow better for him? Would she use those hours to poison him against me? But Ethan seemed completely unconcerned. "It's fine, Grandma," he said. "Let her have her visits. Let her talk. What if she tries to turn you against me?" He looked at me with something close to amusement. "I'm 18, not 8. I know exactly who she is and what she wants. Nothing she says in those visits is going to change 13 years of reality." The first visit took place at a family therapy office in Skokie, in a room designed for court-ordered parent-child reunifications. I dropped Ethan off and waited in my car in the parking lot, unable to drive away even though I wasn't allowed inside. An hour later, he came out and got in the car. I searched his face for signs of distress or confusion, but he just looked slightly tired. "How was it?" I asked carefully. "She talked a lot," he said. "Mostly about herself, about her life in California, her job, her apartment. She asked me about BridgeSpeak, but she didn't really understand what I was explaining. Then she talked about the money and how we need to make sure it's properly managed for my future." "Did she say anything about me?" "She said you've done a good job taking care of me, but that sometimes grandmothers don't understand modern finance and investment strategies." He said it without emotion, just reporting facts. "She said it's nothing personal against you, but that I need someone younger and more financially sophisticated to help guide my decisions." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." He glanced at me. "I'm letting her think she's convincing me. It's better if she feels confident." I didn't understand his strategy, but over the next 2 weeks, through 4 supervised visits, the pattern continued. Rebecca would spend the hour talking about herself, dropping hints about my inadequacies and carefully building her case that she was the better choice to oversee his financial future. And Ethan would come out, report what she'd said, and tell me not to worry. But I was worried. Because while Ethan seemed confident, our legal position was deteriorating. Gerald had hired an investigator to try to find evidence of Rebecca's abandonment, but there was nothing concrete to find. She'd been careful. She'd never put anything damaging in writing. She'd never established formal support obligations she could be proven to have violated. She'd simply faded away, and you can't prove absence. Meanwhile, Rebecca's team had hired their own psychologist, Dr. Martin Rothstein, who filed a report with the court stating that autistic adults with substantial assets frequently benefit from parental oversight, that family involvement reduces the risk of financial exploitation, and that Rebecca's desire to be involved in her son's life was psychologically healthy and should be encouraged. He'd never met Ethan. He'd never met me. But his credentials were impressive, and his report made us sound like we were standing in the way of a beneficial reunion. Gerald brought me copies of Rebecca's latest filing 1 week before the main hearing. She was now requesting not just financial oversight, but retroactive parental rights to his 17th birthday, meaning she wanted access to decisions about the trust fund setup, possibly even claiming she should have been consulted before the app sale was finalized. Her attorneys had found some precedent case from Connecticut where a parent successfully argued they should have been notified before their disabled adult child entered into a major contract. "This is worse than I thought," Gerald admitted, sitting in my living room with papers spread across the coffee table. "Margaret, if they can establish that you deliberately excluded her from the decision-making process on the app sale, they might argue that the trust fund itself is invalid, that Ethan needs a court-appointed conservator to review everything and restart the process with proper parental involvement. Are you saying we could lose all of it? That they could freeze his money? I'm saying it's a possibility. He looked older than his 68 years. I've been practicing law for 42 years, and I've never felt less confident about a case. She has the biological connection. She has the narrative of a mother trying to reconnect. She has expensive attorneys who specialize in this exact type of litigation. And we have our word against hers about what happened 13 years ago. That night, I sat on Ethan's bed while he worked on his laptop, probably coding something I wouldn't understand. I watched him, this brilliant young man with his father's height and his mother's green eyes and a mind that worked in beautiful, complex patterns that neurotypical people would never fully comprehend. I thought about losing him, not physically but legally, to a woman who saw him as a financial asset rather than a person. Gerald thinks we're going to lose, I said quietly. Ethan didn't look up from his screen. Gerald doesn't know everything. What does that mean? It means I've been preparing for this since she first called. Now he did look at me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Grandma, I need you to trust me. I need you to let this hearing happen. I need you to let her present her case. Let her attorneys say everything they want to say. Let her think she's winning. Can you do that? I don't understand. I know you don't, but I need you to trust me anyway. He reached over and squeezed my hand twice. Our old signal. I'm overwhelmed. I need you to understand. Except he didn't look overwhelmed. He looked certain. I squeezed back twice. I'm here. I understand, even though I didn't understand at all. I only knew that I'd spent 13 years trusting this remarkable person to show me how his mind worked, and he'd never let me down. So I would trust him now, even though everything in me screamed that we were heading toward disaster. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Family Court, Judge Patricia Henley presiding. Rebecca's team had filed a motion for an emergency decision, claiming that every day without proper parental oversight put Ethan's assets at risk. They wanted immediate temporary conservatorship pending a full hearing, which would essentially give Rebecca control while the case dragged through the courts for months or possibly years. Gerald spent the weekend preparing our arguments, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. We were going into court with a legal position built on guardianship documents and a trust fund structure, while Rebecca was coming with biological rights and expensive attorneys and a narrative designed to pull at a judge's heartstrings. Sunday night, Ethan came downstairs with his laptop and a small device I didn't recognize. Tomorrow, he said, when we're in court, I'm going to ask to present something. Gerald's going to panic. Don't let him stop me. What are you going to present? Evidence, he said simply. Everything we need to win. What evidence? Gerald said we don't have. Gerald doesn't know what I have. He sat down next to me. Grandma, I've been documenting everything since she first contacted us. Every email, every phone call she's made to anyone about this case, every social media post, every word she said in those supervised visits. I have recordings, digital forensics, financial trails. I have everything. I stared at him. The supervised visits. You were recording her? Illinois is a one-party consent state. I'm allowed to record conversations I'm part of, and I did. He opened his laptop, and I saw folders and folders of files organized with the same meticulous precision he applied to everything. She told me things in those visits, Grandma. Things she thought were safe to say because she thought I was a disabled kid who wouldn't understand or wouldn't be able to use it against her. She was wrong. What kind of things? Wait until tomorrow, he said. I want everyone to hear it at the same time. I want her to be there, confident and smiling, thinking she's about to win, and then I want to show her and everyone else exactly who she is. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces you see on television. Judge Patricia Henley sat behind a raised desk at the front, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. Rebecca and Kessler sat at one table with two additional attorneys I hadn't seen before. They were bringing their full team for this. Gerald, Ethan, and I sat at the other table, and I could feel my hands shaking so badly that I had to keep them folded in my lap. Kessler presented first, and he was good. He was very good. He spoke about Rebecca's constitutional rights as a biological parent, about the importance of family reunification, about the vulnerability of disabled adults with sudden wealth. He presented Dr. Rothstein's psychological evaluation, recommending parental involvement. He showed the birth certificate, the medical records from Ethan's infancy, documentation of Rebecca's postpartum depression diagnosis. He painted a picture of a young mother who'd struggled, who'd made difficult choices, who'd always loved her son even from a distance, and who now wanted to protect his interests. "Your Honor," Kessler said, his voice smooth and confident, "Ms. Harrison is not asking to remove her son from his grandmother's care. She's not questioning the love and dedication Mrs. Chen has shown. She's simply requesting her legal right as a parent to be involved in major financial decisions affecting her son's future. Given Mr. Harrison's documented disability and the substantial assets at stake, this is not only her right but her responsibility." He presented their proposed order: immediate temporary joint conservatorship over Ethan's financial assets, with a full hearing scheduled to make it permanent. Rebecca would have equal say in all investment decisions, all expenditures over $10,000, and all contracts related to Ethan's intellectual property. The trust Gerald and I had established would be dissolved and reformed with Rebecca as co-trustee. Gerald stood to argue our side, and I could hear the strain in his voice. He talked about my guardianship, about the years I'd devoted to Ethan's care, about the carefully structured trust fund designed for Ethan's long-term benefit. But next to Kessler's polished presentation, Gerald sounded defensive and uncertain. He kept saying, "We believe," and "in our opinion," while Kessler had said, "the law clearly states," and "precedent establishes." Judge Henley listened to both presentations, asking occasional questions, her expression unreadable. When Gerald finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at her notes for a long moment. "This is a difficult situation," she said finally. "I have a biological mother with clear parental rights requesting involvement in her son's life. I have a grandmother who has provided exemplary care for 13 years. And I have a young man with documented special needs who has suddenly come into substantial wealth. Mr. Winters, your argument about the grandmother's guardianship is noted, but the court has broad discretion in cases involving disabled adults and financial protection, regardless of their legal age." My heart sank. She was going to rule in Rebecca's favor. I could hear it in her tone, in the way she was framing the situation. I reached for Ethan's hand under the table, squeezing it desperately. 3 squeezes, our signal for "I'm scared." He squeezed back once, a signal we didn't have, one he was inventing right now. "Wait." Then Ethan stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and calm, "may I present evidence?" Judge Henley looked surprised. Gerald looked panicked. Kessler half rose from his chair, already objecting. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Harrison is not qualified to present legal arguments." "I'm not presenting legal arguments," Ethan said. "I'm presenting facts about my mother's actual intentions and actions regarding this case." Judge Henley studied him for a moment. "Mr. Harrison, you're represented by counsel. Any evidence should be presented through your attorney." "My attorney doesn't know about this evidence," Ethan said. "I gathered it myself over the past several weeks. It's relevant to the question of whether my mother's interest in my financial affairs is genuinely about my welfare or about accessing my money for herself." Rebecca's face had gone very pale. Kessler was whispering urgently to her, but she was staring at Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or realization. "Your Honor," Kessler said loudly, "we object to any evidence that wasn't provided during discovery. This is ambush tactics." "If it's relevant evidence," Judge Henley said, "I want to see it." "Mr. Harrison, approach the bench." Ethan picked up his laptop and walked forward with that careful, deliberate way he moved when he was focused. Gerald was frantically flipping through his notes, probably trying to figure out what was happening. I sat frozen, watching my grandson connect his laptop to the courtroom's display system like he'd done this 100 times before. "Your Honor," Ethan said, "my mother has been granted supervised visitation with me twice weekly for the past 2 weeks. Those visits took place at the Skokie Family Therapy Center. Illinois law allows one-party consent for recording conversations. I was a party to those conversations, and I recorded all of them." "Objection!" Kessler was on his feet. "Your Honor, even if the recordings are technically legal, using them in this manner is providing evidence about the true nature of Ms. Harrison's intentions, Ethan finished calmly, which is directly relevant to this hearing. Judge Henley removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, thinking. The courtroom was completely silent. Finally, she put them back on and looked at Ethan. "Play your recording," she said. Ethan pressed a button on his laptop, and Rebecca's voice filled the courtroom. It was from their second visit, and I recognized the casual, confiding tone she'd used, the voice of someone who thought she was talking to a child who wouldn't understand or wouldn't remember. "Ethan, honey, I need you to understand something. Your grandmother loves you, I know that, but she's 75 years old. She doesn't understand modern finance. She doesn't understand investment strategies or wealth management. If you tell the judge you want me involved in your financial decisions, we can make sure your money is properly protected. And you know, it's only fair. I'm your mother. I gave you life. I deserve to benefit from your success too. Maybe not half, but a reasonable percentage. Say 30 or 40%? You wouldn't even miss it, sweetheart. You'd still have millions left." The recording continued. Visit after visit, Rebecca's voice getting more explicit about what she wanted. In the third visit, talking about how we could split the money and I could finally pay off my debts, buy a real house, start the life I deserve. In the fourth visit, laughing as she said, "The kid's autistic. The judge will think he needs protection. We'll convince them you need me, and once I have access to the accounts, we can work out a fair arrangement." And then, most damning of all, a recording that must have been from outside the therapy room, Rebecca on her phone with someone. $7 million, Marcus. Well, 7.8. I just have to pretend to care about the weird kid for a few more weeks, get the judge to give me conservatorship, and then I can access the accounts. I'll take half and disappear again. She'll never see me coming. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for Rebecca's voice calling her son the weird kid and talking about disappearing with his money. When the recording ended, Ethan looked at Judge Henley calmly. "I have 6 more hours of recordings documenting similar statements," he said. "I also have her social media posts from the past 10 years, where she refers to being child-free and calls me the mistake to her friends. I have phone records proving she never once called our home number in 13 years. I have bank records showing she stopped sending any financial support after 8 months. And I have documented evidence that the letters and gifts she claims to have sent never existed. I hired a digital forensic specialist to verify that the emails she presented as evidence were created last month and backdated." He pulled out a folder and handed it to Judge Henley. "This is a notarized affidavit from that specialist detailing the fraud. Creating false evidence to support a legal claim is a crime in Illinois. I've also filed a report with the Illinois Attorney General's office regarding my mother's attempted financial fraud." Rebecca was standing now, her face white, her hands gripping the table. Kessler was gathering papers frantically, whispering to his associates. Gerald was staring at Ethan like he'd never seen him before. Judge Henley was reading through the documents Ethan had provided, her expression growing harder with each page. Finally, she looked up at Rebecca. "Ms. Harrison," she said, her voice cold, "do you have anything to say regarding these recordings?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Kessler put his hand on her arm, and they had a whispered conference that lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then Kessler stood. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to consult with our client." "Denied," Judge Henley said flatly. "Ms. Harrison, I asked you a direct question." Rebecca was still standing, her hands now visibly shaking as they gripped the edge of the table. The confident, polished woman who'd walked into this courtroom an hour ago had completely disappeared. In her place was someone who looked cornered, desperate, and finally caught. "Your Honor," she started, her voice thin and reedy, nothing like the smooth tone she'd been using all morning. "Those recordings are taken out of context. I was trying to bond with my son, trying to speak in terms he'd understand." "Ms. Harrison," Judge Henley interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "I just listened to you refer to your son as the weird kid and discuss taking his money and disappearing. What context makes that acceptable?" "I didn't mean... I was frustrated. I was on the phone with a friend. I was venting." "You were planning fraud." Judge Henley's words landed like hammer blows. You came into my courtroom with fabricated evidence, with manufactured emails, with a psychological evaluation from a doctor who never met your son, all designed to convince me to give you access to a substantial fortune that your son, not you, earned. Is that correct? Kessler stood up quickly. Your Honor, my client is clearly distressed. We request a continuance to— Sit down, Mr. Kessler. Judge Henley didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Rebecca. Ms. Harrison, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you fabricate evidence to support your claim in this case? The silence stretched out. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear someone's chair creaking, could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Rebecca looked at Kessler, and I saw something pass between them. Some wordless communication about legal exposure, about criminal charges, about just how bad this could get for her if she kept lying. I may have exaggerated some details, Rebecca finally said, and her voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. About the letters, about the money I sent, about trying to stay in contact. I thought it would help my case. You thought lying under oath would help your case, Judge Henley said flatly. I'm his mother. Rebecca's voice suddenly rose, and I heard something in it that might have been genuine emotion for the first time all morning. But it wasn't love or regret. It was rage. I gave birth to him. I have rights. Just because he turned out to be difficult, just because raising him was harder than I expected, just because I needed to put my own life first for a while, that doesn't erase the fact that he's my son. That money should be mine too. The words hung in the air like poison. Even Kessler looked shocked. One of his associates actually put her head in her hands. Difficult, Ethan said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. He was still standing at the front of the room, completely calm, watching his mother with those steady green eyes. You called me difficult. You called me a mistake. You called me the weird kid. You left when I was 5 years old because I had autism, and that was too hard for you. You never called on my birthday. You never sent Christmas cards. You never asked how I was doing or if I needed anything. You disappeared completely for 13 years. Ethan, sweetheart, you don't understand. Don't call me sweetheart. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. You don't get to use pet names. You don't get to pretend you care about me. You showed me exactly who you are in those visits. You thought I was too disabled to understand what you were really saying, too naive to record it, too trusting to use it against you. You underestimated me because you never bothered to know me. Rebecca's face crumpled, and she started crying, big, dramatic sobs that might have been effective if we all hadn't just heard her on those recordings, laughing about taking his money. I made mistakes, she gasped out between sobs. I was young, I was overwhelmed, I didn't know how to handle a special needs child. I'm autistic, Ethan said clearly. Not broken, not damaged, not someone who needed to be handled. I'm a person who thinks differently, who processes the world differently, who needed patience and understanding and support. Grandma gave me all of that. You gave me nothing. He turned to Judge Henley, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm and factual, like he was presenting a coding problem instead of dismantling his mother's legal case. Your Honor, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence. When I turned 18, anticipating that my mother might resurface once she learned about the app sale, I worked with a different attorney, not Mr. Winters, because I didn't want to burden him with this, to legally emancipate myself and establish an irrevocable trust. He pulled out another document and handed it to the judge. This trust names my grandmother as sole trustee until I turn 25, at which point I gain full control. It's structured to be protected from exactly this type of claim. The trust was established before my mother filed her motions, which means her request for conservatorship is moot. The assets are already in a protected trust with designated management. Gerald was staring at the document like he'd never seen it before, which he probably hadn't. I certainly hadn't. Ethan had done all of this on his own, quietly, methodically, anticipating this exact scenario and preparing for it months in advance. Judge Henley was reading through the trust documents, her expression shifting from anger to something that might have been impressed. This is very thorough, she said. Mr. Harrison, who helped you draft this? Sarah Kim, Esquire, from the firm Morrison & Associates, Ethan said. They specialize in special needs trusts and asset protection. I paid for her services from my early app development work before the sale to Nexus. Everything was done properly and legally. Kessler had grabbed the document and was reading through it frantically, his face getting redder with each page. Your Honor, this trust was clearly established in anticipation of litigation, which could be argued as a smart legal move by a competent adult protecting his assets, Judge Henley finished. Mr. Kessler, your client came into my court with fraudulent evidence, recorded admissions of planning financial fraud, and has just stated on the record that she views her son as difficult and believes she deserves his money despite abandoning him for 13 years. I'm struggling to find any legal ground you're standing on at this moment. Your Honor, if we could just have time to... Time to what? Fabricate more evidence? Coach your client on better lies? Judge Henley removed her glasses and set them on her desk with a sharp click. Let me be very clear about what I'm seeing here. A young man with autism, who, I might note, has just demonstrated better legal planning and strategic thinking than many attorneys I've seen in this courtroom, created a valuable product through his own intelligence and hard work. His grandmother, who raised him from age 5, supported him through every challenge and clearly helped him develop into an articulate, capable adult, established appropriate financial management for his assets. And his biological mother, who voluntarily abandoned him as a child, returned only when there was money to be gained and attempted to commit fraud to access that money. Rebecca was crying harder now, but it was desperate, ugly crying, the crying of someone who knows they've lost everything. Please, she said, looking at Ethan instead of the judge. Please, I'm sorry. I need that money. I have debts. I have bills. I made bad investments. You made bad choices, Ethan said quietly. You chose to leave me. You chose to stop being my mother. You chose to come back only when I had something you wanted. Those were your choices, not mine. I'm your mother, Rebecca screamed at this time, standing up so fast her chair fell backward. You can't just cut me out. I have rights. You have the rights you didn't voluntarily relinquish, Judge Henley said, her voice cold enough to freeze water. And based on the evidence presented here today, you relinquished those rights 13 years ago when you walked away from your son. Ms. Harrison, I'm denying your motion for conservatorship in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm ordering that you have no contact with Ethan Harrison moving forward unless he, as a legal adult, specifically requests it. The existing trust structure will remain in place with Margaret Chen as sole trustee. Your Honor, Kessler tried one more time, his voice strained. We request the opportunity to appeal. You can request whatever you want, Mr. Kessler, but I strongly suggest you advise your client that appealing this decision will only create more legal exposure for her. Judge Henley picked up one of the documents Ethan had provided. These recordings and this evidence of fabricated documents constitute potential criminal fraud. I'm going to give Ms. Harrison an opportunity to walk out of this courtroom right now and never return. If she appeals, if she files any further motions, if she makes any attempt to contact Ethan or access his assets, I will personally refer this case to the Illinois Attorney General for prosecution. Am I making myself clear? Rebecca was staring at the judge with her mouth open, mascara running down her face, all her polish and confidence completely shattered. Kessler had his hand on her arm again, whispering urgently in her ear. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could guess. He was telling her to take the deal, to walk away, to count herself lucky she wasn't being arrested right now. Do you understand, Ms. Harrison? Judge Henley asked again, her voice harder. Yes, Rebecca whispered. Yes, I understand. Then I suggest you leave my courtroom. Kessler began gathering papers with shaking hands, stuffing them into his briefcase without any of his earlier smooth confidence. His associates were already heading for the door, but Rebecca just stood there for a moment, staring at Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hatred, maybe, or loss, or the dawning realization of what she'd thrown away 13 years ago and would never get back. Ethan, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely clear. No, you're not. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you didn't get the money. You're not sorry for leaving me, or for calling me the weird kid, or for trying to steal what I earned. You're just sorry that your plan didn't work. He paused, and I saw something in his face, Not anger, not hatred, but something sadder and more final than either of those. "Grandma taught me something important," he said. "She taught me that people show you who they are through their actions, not their words. For 13 years, your actions showed me you didn't want to be my mother. These past weeks, your actions showed me you only wanted my money. I don't need to hear your words anymore. I already know exactly who you are." Rebecca made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Then Kessler had her arm and was pulling her toward the door, whispering urgently that they needed to leave right now, immediately, before the judge changed her mind about prosecution. The other attorneys were already gone. Within seconds, Rebecca was being led out of the courtroom, still crying, her expensive suit rumpled and her careful appearance completely destroyed. The door closed behind them, with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silent room. Judge Henley sat back in her chair and looked at Ethan for a long moment. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally, and her voice was much gentler than it had been, "that was some of the most impressive legal preparation I've seen from a non-attorney. You should consider law school." "Thank you, Your Honor," Ethan said politely, "but I'm planning to study computer science and assistive technology. I want to expand BridgeSpeak to help more people like me." "Then you'll do extraordinary things," she said. She looked at me then, and I saw something that might have been respect in her eyes. "Mrs. Chen, you've clearly done an exceptional job raising your grandson. The court recognizes and commends your guardianship. The trust structure stays in place as established. This case is closed." She gathered her papers and stood up. "And off the record," she added, looking at Ethan one more time, "your mother severely underestimated you. Most people probably do. I suspect that's their mistake, not yours." Then she left, her clerk following behind her, and suddenly it was just the three of us, Gerald, Ethan, and me, standing in an empty courtroom where we'd just won a battle I hadn't been sure we could win. Gerald was the first to move. He walked over to Ethan and just stared at him for a moment. "You hired a separate attorney," he said finally. "You established a trust. You recorded everything. You prepared for all of this months ago." "I saw the pattern," Ethan said simply. "She left when I became difficult. When I became successful, she'd come back. It was predictable behavior, and I prepared for it." "You should have told me," Gerald said. But there was no anger in his voice, just amazement. "I spent weeks thinking we were going to lose. I needed everyone to think we might lose," Ethan said, "including you and Grandma. If you'd known what I had, you might have acted differently, seemed too confident. She needed to feel safe, to feel like she was winning, so she'd keep talking and giving me more evidence." He'd played her. My 18-year-old grandson with autism, who Rebecca had dismissed as the weird kid who wouldn't understand what she was doing, had systematically documented her fraud, anticipated her legal strategy, and dismantled her case so thoroughly that she'd left the courtroom in tears and disgrace. He'd done it calmly, methodically, without anger or drama, just pure, brilliant strategic thinking. I walked over to him and pulled him into a hug. He stiffened for just a second. Unexpected touch was still hard for him, but then he relaxed and hugged me back. "You terrified me," I said into his shoulder. "For weeks you terrified me. I thought we were going to lose everything." "I'm sorry I scared you," he said quietly. "But I needed her to think she was winning. People make mistakes when they're confident. She made so many mistakes." I pulled back to look at him, this remarkable young man I'd raised, who'd just protected both of us with a level of strategic thinking I could barely comprehend. "When did you become so much smarter than me?" I asked, half laughing, half crying. "I'm not smarter than you, Grandma," he said seriously. "You taught me everything that mattered. You taught me to document things, to think ahead, to protect what's important. You taught me that actions matter more than words. I just applied what you taught me." We stood there in that empty courtroom for another moment, the three of us, while I tried to process what had just happened. Rebecca was gone. The case was over. Ethan's money was safe. More than that, Ethan had proven, to the court, to his mother, and maybe to himself, that being autistic didn't make him vulnerable or naive or easy to manipulate. It just meant his brilliant mind worked differently, saw patterns others missed, and could execute a plan with precision that neurotypical people couldn't match. Rebecca had spent 13 years underestimating him. She'd paid for that mistake with everything she'd come here to take. The days following the hearing moved quickly, but they felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream where everything had suddenly shifted into sharp focus after weeks of fog and fear. Gerald called me the next morning to tell me that Kessler's firm had filed paperwork withdrawing from Rebecca's case entirely, and that Rebecca herself had signed a formal agreement never to contact Ethan again. The agreement had been delivered at 7 in the morning, less than 24 hours after the hearing. "She's terrified of prosecution," Gerald explained, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Kessler probably spent all night explaining exactly how much legal trouble she's in. Creating false evidence, attempting financial fraud, lying under oath, any one of those could result in criminal charges. By signing this agreement and walking away completely, she's hoping the Attorney General's office will decide not to pursue the case. And will they? I asked. Ethan filed his complaint, but he also included a statement saying he doesn't wish to press charges as long as she honors the no-contact agreement and never attempts to access his assets again. The AG will probably accept that resolution. They got what they wanted. The fraud stopped, the victim protected, the bad actor neutralized. They don't need to spend taxpayer money prosecuting her unless she violates the agreement. So that was it. Rebecca had signed away any claim to her son, any right to contact him, any future attempt to be part of his life. She'd signed it quickly, desperately, probably with Kessler standing over her shoulder, reminding her of prison sentences and criminal records. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt sad. Not for her, but for what could have been if she'd ever actually tried to be Ethan's mother, instead of seeing him as either a burden or a bank account. The media attention died down quickly once word spread about the hearing's outcome. TechCrunch published a brief update noting that the family dispute had been resolved in favor of the developer, but didn't include details about the fraud or the recordings. Within a week, Ethan's story had faded from the tech news cycle, replaced by the next young entrepreneur, the next revolutionary app, the next viral success story. We returned to being invisible, which was exactly what both of us preferred. Ethan started college in January at Northwestern, studying computer science and assistive technology design. He'd been accepted to several prestigious programs, including MIT and Stanford, but he chose Northwestern because it was 20 minutes from our house in Evanston. He still lives with me, still has his room with his books organized by color and size, still sits at the kitchen table doing homework while I make dinner. The money hasn't changed our daily routine. We're still us. What the money has changed is the scope of what Ethan can do with BridgeSpeak. He's used part of the trust fund to establish a foundation that provides free communication devices to autistic children whose families can't afford them. He's hired a small team of developers, all of them neurodivergent themselves, to expand the app's capabilities. He gives talks at schools and therapy centers about assistive technology, standing in front of rooms full of parents and teachers, and explaining how communication barriers can be bridged if people are willing to think differently about what communication means. I go to those talks sometimes, sitting in the back row, watching him present complex ideas with the same calm precision he used in that courtroom. People listen to him now in a way they might not have before, because success gives you credibility, even when your brain works differently than most people's brains. But I listened to him before he was successful, before he had millions of dollars, before he'd proven anything to anyone except me. I listened because he always had important things to say, even when the words came slowly or the ideas seemed unusual. I just had to learn his language first. The trust fund that caused so much trouble is being managed beautifully by the financial advisors Ethan selected, a firm that specializes in special needs financial planning and understands that the money isn't for luxury or extravagance, but for security and purpose. Most of it is invested conservatively, growing steadily for Ethan's long-term future. Some of it funds his foundation. A small portion goes to his education and his continued work on BridgeSpeak. We still live modestly because that's who we are, though I did finally let Ethan buy me a new car when mine hit 200,000 miles. He chose a sensible Honda Accord, silver, with good safety ratings. That's my grandson, practical even with millions in the bank. I think about Rebecca sometimes, though I try not to. I wonder where she is, what she's doing, whether she ever thinks about what she lost. Not the money. I doubt she's capable of genuinely regretting losing Ethan as a person. But the opportunity to know someone extraordinary. She had a son who sees the world in unique and brilliant ways, who can identify patterns that others miss, who created something beautiful and functional that helps people communicate when words fail them. She could have been part of that journey. She could have been there for his first app launch, his first college acceptance letter, his first presentation to a room full of professionals who hung on his every word. She chose not to be, and then she chose to come back only when there was money involved. Those choices define her more clearly than anything I could say about her character. Ethan doesn't talk about her. When people ask about his family, professors, classmates, journalists occasionally, he simply says he was raised by his grandmother and leaves it at that. He doesn't elaborate on the abandonment or the court case or any of it. To him, she's simply irrelevant, a closed chapter in a book he's no longer reading. I think that's healthier than holding on to anger or hurt. She doesn't deserve space in his thoughts or his emotional energy. He's moved on completely, which is perhaps the most final rejection she could have received. What's changed most profoundly is my understanding of Ethan himself. I spent 13 years protecting him, advocating for him, fighting for his needs to be met in a world not designed for minds like his. I saw myself as his shield, his voice when he struggled to find words, his defender against people who didn't understand or didn't want to try. And I was all those things. I don't regret a single moment of it. But the court case taught me that while I was protecting him, he was also learning from me. He was watching how I documented things, how I planned ahead, how I thought strategically about potential problems before they became actual crises. He was absorbing lessons I didn't know I was teaching. And when the moment came that he needed to protect both of us, he did it with a level of sophistication and strategic thinking that left me breathless. I wasn't just raising him. He was becoming himself, developing his own methods and strategies, and ways of navigating a world that often underestimates people who think differently. The autism that Rebecca saw as a deficit that made her call him difficult and the weird kid is inseparable from the brilliant pattern recognition and systematic thinking that let him anticipate her moves and document everything he needed to defeat her legal case. His neurodivergence isn't something to be fixed or overcome. It's fundamental to who he is and how his remarkable mind works. Last week, we were sitting on the back porch on one of those rare warm evenings in early spring, and Ethan was working on code for a new feature in BridgeSpeak while I read a book. The sun was setting over the neighbor's house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and everything felt peaceful, in a way it hasn't felt since before Rebecca's first phone call. "Grandma," Ethan said suddenly, not looking up from his laptop. "Thank you." "For what, sweetheart?" "For staying. For not leaving when things got hard. For learning how to communicate with me instead of trying to make me communicate like everyone else. For seeing me as someone worth the effort." My throat got tight. "Ethan, you were never effort. You were always worth everything." "I know," he said simply. "But not everyone knows that. She didn't know that. She thought I was too difficult, too different, too much work. You never did." He finally looked up at me then, those green eyes that see so much more than most people realize. "You taught me that love is about actions, not words." That's what let me see what she really wanted. She said all the right words, but her actions told the truth. Just like your actions always told the truth about how you felt about me. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while longer, and I thought about how this story could have ended so differently. If Ethan had been just a little less observant, a little less strategic, a little less capable of seeing the pattern of Rebecca's behavior and preparing for it. If I had handled the guardianship differently 13 years ago, or if Rebecca had been more careful about what she said, or if the judge had been less willing to hear Ethan's evidence. But it didn't end those ways. It ended with us still together, still in our house in Evanston, still living our quiet life that's now backed by financial security, and the knowledge that we can weather even the worst storms. It ended with Ethan proving that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have, because people make mistakes when they think you're not watching, not understanding, not preparing your own defense. Rebecca underestimated him because she never knew him. She saw a diagnosis instead of a person, a disability instead of a different kind of ability. That was always her greatest mistake, even bigger than the fraud or the lies or the abandonment. She never bothered to know who Ethan actually was, and so she never stood a chance against him. I knew who he was. I'd spent 13 years learning him, understanding him, watching him grow into someone extraordinary. When he told me to trust him in that conference room, I did. Not because I understood his plan, but because I understood him. That trust was built on thousands of days of shared experience, of communication that went deeper than words, of love expressed through action rather than empty promises. That's the real story here, I think. Not the money or the court case or the dramatic confrontation. The real story is that trust wins over biology, that patience wins over convenience, that love expressed through daily action wins over everything else. Rebecca had biological connection and legal arguments and expensive attorneys. I had 13 years of showing up, of learning a new language, of choosing Ethan every single day, even when it was hard. In the end, that's what mattered. That's what won. That's what will always win, because real connection isn't built on DNA or legal documents. It's built on the 1,000 small choices that say, "You matter to me," more clearly than any words ever could. Ethan went back to his coding, and I went back to my book, and the sun finished setting over Evanston. We were right where we belonged, right where we'd always been, together, safe, home.